Textual criticism is a branch of textual scholarship, philology, and literary criticism that is concerned with the identification of transcription errors in texts, both manuscripts and printed books. Ancient scribes made alterations when copying manuscripts by hand. Given a manuscript copy, several or many copies, but not the original document, the textual critic might seek to reconstruct the original text as closely as possible. The same processes can be used to attempt to reconstruct intermediate versions, or recensions, of a document's transcription history. The ultimate objective of the textual critic's work is the production of a critical edition, containing a text most closely approximating the original. There are three fundamental approaches to textual criticism: eclecticism, schematics, and copy text editing. Techniques from the biological discipline of cladistics are currently also being used to determine the relationships between manuscripts. The phrase "lower criticism" is used to describe the contrast between textual criticism and higher criticism, which is the endeavor to establish the authorship, date, and place of composition of the original text. History. Textual criticism has been practiced for over 2,000 years. Early textual critics were concerned with preserving the works of antiquity, and this continued through the medieval period into early modern times until the invention of the printing press. Many ancient works, such as the Bible and the Greek tragedies, survive in hundreds of copies, and the relationship of each copy to the original may be unclear. Textual scholars have debated for centuries which sources are most closely derived from the original, hence which readings in those sources are correct. Although biblical books that are letters, like Greek plays, presumably had one original, the question of whether some biblical books, like the Gospels, ever had just one original has been discussed. Interest in applying textual criticism to the Quran has also developed after the discovery of the Sanna manuscripts in 1972, which possibly date back to the 7th-8th centuries. In the English language, the works of Shakespeare have been a particularly fertile ground for textual criticism, both because the texts, as transmitted, contain a considerable amount of variation, and because the effort and expense of producing superior editions of his works have always been widely viewed as worthwhile. The principles of textual criticism, although originally developed and refined for works of antiquity, the Bible, and Shakespeare, have been applied to many works, extending backwards from the present to the earliest known written documents. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, a period of about 5 millennia. However, the application of textual criticism to non-religious works does not antedate the invention of printing. While Christianity has been relatively receptive to textual criticism, application of it to the Jewish Torah and the Quran is, to the devout, taboo. Basic notions and objectives. The basic problem, as described by Paul Marsh, is as follows. We have no autograph handwritten by the original author, manuscripts of the Greek and Roman classical writers, and no copies which have been collated with the originals. The manuscripts we possess derive from the originals through an unknown number of intermediate copies, and are consequently of questionable trustworthiness. The business of textual criticism is to produce a text as close as possible to the original. Marsh comments further that a dictation revised by the author must be regarded as equivalent to an autograph manuscript. The lack of autograph manuscripts applies to many cultures other than Greek and Roman. In such a situation, a key objective becomes the identification of the first exemplar before any split in the tradition. That exemplar is known as the archetype. If we succeed in establishing the text of the archetype, the constitution is considerably advanced. The textual critic's ultimate objective is the production of a critical edition. This contains the text that the author has determined most closely approximates the original, and is accompanied by an apparatus criticus or critical apparatus. The critical apparatus presents the author's work in three parts. First, a list or description of the evidence that the editor used. Second, the editor's analysis of that evidence. And third, a record of rejected variants of the text. Process. Before mechanical printing, literature was copied by hand, and many variations were introduced by copyists. The age of printing made the scribal profession effectively redundant. Printed editions, while less susceptible to the proliferation of variations likely to arise during manual transmission, are nonetheless not immune to introducing variations from an author's autograph. Instead of a scribe miscopying his source, a compositor or a printing shop may read or typeset a work in a way that differs from the autograph. Since each scribe or printer commits different errors, reconstruction of the lost original is often aided by a selection of readings taken from many sources. An edited text that draws from multiple sources is said to be eclectic. In contrast to this approach, some textual critics prefer to identify the single best surviving text, and not to combine readings from multiple sources. When comparing different documents, or witnesses, of a single, original text, the observed differences are called variant readings, or simply variants or readings. It is not always apparent which single variant represents the author's original work. The process of textual criticism seeks to explain how each variant may have entered the text, either by accident or intention, as scribes or supervisors transmitted the original author's text by copying it. The textual critic's task, therefore, is to sort through the variants, eliminating those most likely to be unoriginal, hence establishing a critical text, or critical edition, that is intended to best approximate the original. At the same time, the critical text should document variant readings, so the relation of extant witnesses to the reconstructed original is apparent to a reader of the critical edition. In establishing the critical text, the textual critic considers both external evidence and internal, or physical, considerations. The collation of all known variants of a text is referred to as a variorum, namely a work of textual criticism whereby all variations and emendations are set side by side so that a reader can track how textual decisions have been made in the preparation of a text for publication. The Bible and the works of William Shakespeare have often been the subjects of variorum editions, although the same techniques have been applied with less frequency to many other works, such as Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, and the prose writings of Edward Fitzgerald. Eclecticism. Eclecticism refers to the practice of consulting a wide diversity of witnesses to a particular original. The practice is based on the principle that the more independent transmission histories are, the less likely they will be to reproduce the same errors. What one omits, the others may retain. What one adds, the others are unlikely to add. Eclecticism allows inferences to be drawn regarding the original text based on the evidence of contrasts between witnesses. Eclectic readings also normally give an impression of the number of witnesses to each available reading. Although a reading supported by the majority of witnesses is frequently preferred, this does not follow automatically. For example, a second edition of a Shakespeare play may include an addition alluding to an event known to have happened between the two editions. Although nearly all subsequent manuscripts may have included the addition, textual critics may reconstruct the original without the addition. The result of the process is a text with readings drawn from many witnesses. It is not a copy of any particular manuscript, and may deviate from the majority of existing manuscripts. In a purely eclectic approach, no single witness is theoretically favored. Instead, the critic forms opinions about individual witnesses, relying on both external and internal evidence. Since the mid-19th century, eclecticism, in which there is no a priori bias to a single manuscript, has been the dominant method of editing the Greek text of the New Testament. Even so, the oldest manuscripts, being of the Alexandrian text type, are the most favored, and the critical text has an Alexandrian disposition. External evidence. External evidence is evidence of each physical witness, its date, source, and relationship to other known witnesses. Critics will often prefer the readings supported by the oldest witnesses. Since errors tend to accumulate, older manuscripts should have fewer errors. Readings supported by a majority of witnesses are also usually preferred, since these are less likely to reflect accidents or individual biases. For the same reasons, the most geographically diverse witnesses are preferred. Some manuscripts show evidence that particular care was taken in their composition, for example, by including alternative readings in their margins, demonstrating that more than one prior copy was consulted in producing the current one. Other factors being equal, these are the best witnesses. The role of the textual critic is necessary when these basic criteria are in conflict. For instance, there will typically be fewer early copies, and a larger number of later copies. The textual critic will attempt to balance these criteria, to determine the original text. There are many other more sophisticated considerations. For example, readings that depart from the known practice of a scribe or a given period may be deemed more reliable, since a scribe is unlikely on his own initiative to have departed from the usual practice. Internal evidence is evidence that comes from the text itself, independent of the physical characteristics of the document. Various considerations can be used to decide which reading is the most likely to be original. Sometimes these considerations can be in conflict. Two common considerations have the Latin names lectio brevia and lectio difficilia. The first is the general observation that scribes tended to add words, for clarification or out of habit, more often than they removed them. The second, lectio difficilia posterior, recognizes the tendency for harmonization, resolving apparent inconsistencies in the text. Applying this principle leads to taking the more difficult reading as being more likely to be the original. Such cases also include scribes simplifying and smoothing texts they did not fully understand. Another scribal tendency is called homoioteliuton, meaning same endings. Homoioteliuton occurs when two words, phrases, lines end with the same sequence of letters. The scribe, having finished copying the first, skips to the second, omitting all intervening words. Homoeoarchy refers to I skip when the beginnings of two lines are similar. The critic may also examine the other writings of the author to decide what words and grammatical constructions match his style. The evaluation of internal evidence also provides the critic with information that helps him evaluate the reliability of individual manuscripts. Thus, the consideration of internal and external evidence is related. After considering all relevant factors, the textual critic seeks the reading that best explains how the other readings would arise. That reading is then the most likely candidate to have been original. Canons of textual criticism. Various scholars have developed guidelines, or canons of textual criticism, to guide the exercise of the critic's judgment in determining the best readings of a text. One of the earliest was Johann Albrecht Bengel, who in 1734 produced an edition of the Greek New Testament. In his commentary, he established the rule Procliver scriptione praestat ardua. Johann Jacob Griesbach published several editions of the New Testament. In his 1796 edition, he established 15 critical rules. Among them was a variant of Bengel's rule, lectio difficilia posterior, the harder reading is better. Another was lectio brevia pro referenda, the shorter reading is better, based on the idea that scribes were more likely to add and to delete. This rule cannot be applied uncritically, as scribes may omit material inadvertently. Brooke, Foss, Westcott and Fenton J. A. Hort published an edition of the New Testament in Greek in 1881. They proposed 9 critical rules, including a version of Bengel's rule. The reading is less likely to be original. That shows a disposition to smooth away difficulties. They also argued that readings are approved or rejected by reason of the quality, and not the number, of their supporting witnesses, and that the reading is to be preferred that most fitly explains the existence of the others. Many of these rules although originally developed for biblical textual criticism, have wide applicability to any text susceptible to errors of transmission. Limitations of eclecticism. Since the canons of criticism are highly susceptible to interpretation, and at times even contradict each other, they may be employed to justify a result that fits the textual critic's aesthetic or theological agenda. Starting in the 19th century, scholars sought more rigorous methods to guide editorial judgment. Best text editing became one extreme. Stemmatics and copy text editing, while both eclectic, in that they permit the editor to select readings from multiple sources, sought to reduce subjectivity by establishing one or a few witnesses, presumably as being favored by objective criteria, the citing of sources used, and alternate readings, and the use of original text and images helps readers and other critics determine to an extent the depth of research of the critic, and to independently verify their work.